On the morning of March 14, 1907, Thomas Garrett walked into the Chicago Police Department Central Station on Harrison Street. He was 29 years old. He had been missing for 11 days. The desk sergeant's report, preserved in the municipal archives, describes him as disheveled but composed, requesting to file a formal statement regarding the whereabouts of his person during the period beginning March 3rd. The sergeant noted that Garrett's hands were bandaged, his coat was missing, and he smelled strongly of lake water and something else, something the sergeant recorded as chemical or industrial in nature. When asked where he had been, Garrett said, "I was detained." When asked by whom, he said, "I'd prefer to speak with Detective Byrne." Detective James Byrne arrived within the hour. The interview lasted 17 minutes. No transcript exists, but Byrne's summary notation, filed that same afternoon, reads, "Subject declines to provide account of disappearance. States he was alone during relevant period. Requests notification of next of kin regarding status of Robert Fales, William Mundy, and Henry Garrett. Subject advised all 3 men remain missing. Subject offered no reaction. Henry Garrett was Thomas's younger brother. Byrne noted that Thomas refused medical examination. He refused food. He asked only for water, which he drank from a tin cup without setting it down, and for confirmation that his statement, brief as it was, had been recorded. When Byrne asked if he had information regarding the missing men, Thomas said, "I do not." When Byrne asked if he had witnessed anything that might assist in locating them, Thomas said, "I did not." The detective's final observation: subject maintains steady eye contact, shows no signs of deception or distress. Affect notably flat. Recommended psychiatric evaluation declined. Thomas Garrett left the station at 11:40 that morning. He returned to his boarding house on West Van Buren Street, paid 2 weeks' rent in advance, and did not leave his room for 6 days. The landlady, Mrs. Dvorak, told a Tribune reporter 3 weeks later that she heard him pacing at night. "Back and forth," she said. "Same 8 steps, over and over. I thought he was counting something." By the time the families of the missing men began to press for answers, Thomas had already made his position clear. He would say nothing further. Not to police, not to journalists, not even to his own mother, who traveled from Evanston and sat outside his door for an entire afternoon, begging him to tell her what had happened to Henry. A neighbor in the boarding house recalled hearing her voice through the walls. "Tommy, please, just tell me if he suffered." The door never opened. To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. Thomas Garrett had worked for the Chicago Tunnel Company since 1904, part of the crew responsible for maintaining the expanding network of narrow-gauge freight tunnels beneath the city. These tunnels, 40 feet below street level, were used to transport coal, goods, and mail between buildings, a subterranean railway invisible to most Chicagoans. The work was steady, unionized, and paid well enough for a young man to save toward a future. Robert Fales, 32, was the crew foreman. Records describe him as reliable and experienced, a veteran of the tunnel projects in New York. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 daughters. Payroll ledgers show he often worked double shifts to cover school fees. William Mundy, 27, was a recent immigrant from County Cork. He sent money home every month. His boarding house landlord later described him as quiet, pious, never missed mass. A photograph survives, a slender man with dark eyes, standing stiffly in a borrowed suit. Henry Garrett was 23. He had followed his older brother into the tunnels 6 months earlier, against their mother's wishes. Thomas had vouched for him personally. Letters between the brothers, preserved by their mother and later donated to the Chicago History Museum, reveal an easy affection. Henry called Thomas the warden. Thomas called Henry the apprentice. In a letter dated February 10, 1907, Henry wrote, "Tommy says I'm getting the hang of it, says I might make foreman myself one day if I keep my head on straight. He watches out for me down there, always has." The 4 men formed a maintenance unit assigned to Section 7, the tunnels running beneath the financial district. Their work involved inspecting rail lines, shoring up brick archways, and clearing debris from collapsed sections. It was dark, cold, and often dangerous. Cave-ins were common. Flooding was a constant threat. But the men trusted each other. Interviews conducted in the weeks following the disappearance confirmed this repeatedly. A fellow tunnelman, Joseph Garrett, told police, "You put your life in another man's hands down there." Fales ran a tight crew. Garrett, Thomas I mean, he was steady. Didn't talk much, but you wanted him next to you if something went wrong. Margaret Fales, when questioned, said her husband had mentioned Thomas by name. He said Thomas had good instincts, said he noticed things before they became problems. On the evening of March 2nd, 1907, the four men descended into Section 7 for a routine overnight shift. Their task was to inspect a segment of tunnel near the intersection of LaSalle and Washington, where recent subsidence had been reported. They signed in at 9:15 p.m. The logbook, preserved in the Chicago Tunnel Company archives, shows their names in Fales's handwriting. Fales, Mundy, T. Garrett, H. Garrett. Beside the entry, someone, likely the night supervisor, had written, "Expected return, 6 a.m." They were seen entering the access shaft by two other workers, who later testified that the crew seemed in good spirits. Henry Garrett had been carrying a lunch pail. Thomas had been carrying a coil of rope. That was the last confirmed sighting of all four men together. The reconstruction of what happened next is necessarily incomplete. The physical evidence is sparse, the testimonies are contradictory, and the only living witness refused to provide one. What is known? At approximately 2:30 a.m. on March 3rd, a tunnel supervisor named Albert Driscoll, working in an adjacent section, reported hearing a loud cracking sound, followed by rushing water. He immediately sounded the alarm and ordered an evacuation of all crews in the vicinity. The source of the flooding was later determined to be a breach in the tunnel wall near the Chicago River. Engineers speculated that pressure from recent rainfall, combined with deteriorating brickwork, had caused a catastrophic failure. Water poured into Section 7 at an estimated rate of 2,000 gallons per minute. Driscoll's testimony, given to investigators on March 5th, states, "I sent two men down to Section 7 to warn Fales's crew. They came back and said the passage was already flooded past the first junction. No way through. Emergency pumps were activated, but it took nearly 4 hours to stem the flow and another 6 to drain the affected tunnels. By the time rescue teams entered Section 7, it was mid-morning on March 3rd. They found no bodies. They found Fales's tool bag, waterlogged and caught against a support beam. They found a single boot, later identified as belonging to William Mundy. They found Henry Garrett's lunch pail, dented and empty, lodged in a drainage grate. They did not find Thomas Garrett. Search efforts continued for 3 days. Divers were brought in to explore submerged sections. Every access point was checked. The river itself was dragged. On March 6th, the official search was suspended. The four men were presumed dead. Then, 8 days later, Thomas walked into the police station. When pressed by Detective Byrne to explain how he had survived, Thomas said only, "I found a way out." When asked where that way was, he said, "I don't remember." When asked if the others had been with him, he paused. Byrne noted the pause in his report. Then Thomas said, "No." When asked when he had last seen them, Thomas said, "I don't recall." Byrne, in a separate memo to his captain, wrote, "Subject's refusal to cooperate borders on obstruction. However, no evidence of criminal conduct. Recommend continued surveillance." The families were less restrained. Margaret Fales confronted Thomas outside his boarding house on March 20th. A witness, a streetcar conductor named Emil Kowalski, reported the encounter to the Daily News. She was crying, asking him why her husband didn't come back, asking if he left them behind. The man, Garrett, he just stood there, didn't say a word. She hit him, right across the face. He didn't even flinch. Henry Garrett's mother, Elizabeth, took a different approach. She wrote letters, dozens of them. The Chicago History Museum holds 23 letters written between March and December of 1907, all addressed to Thomas, all returned unopened. One, dated April 2nd, was later opened by museum archivists. It reads, in part, "I do not ask you to bring him back. I know you cannot. I ask only that you tell me the truth. Was he afraid? Did he call for me? Tommy, you are my son too, but Henry was my baby. Please, I am begging you. There is no record of a response. The pressure on Thomas Garrett did not relent. In late March, the Chicago Tunnel Company offered him a settlement, a year's wages in exchange for his resignation, and a signed affidavit stating that the company bore no responsibility for the incident. Thomas accepted the money, but refused to sign any document. When the company's attorney threatened legal action, Thomas reportedly said, "For what? I didn't say anything." The attorney, in a letter to the company president, noted, "Subject is legally correct. Without testimony, we have no liability exposure. Recommend we let the matter rest." The Chicago Tribune ran a series of articles in April under the headline, "The Man Who Won't Talk." The coverage was sensational, but sparse on facts, given that Thomas declined all interviews. One reporter, Helen Morse, managed to corner him outside a grocer's on Halsted Street. Her published account describes the encounter. "I asked Mr. Garrett if he felt any responsibility for the deaths of his companions. He stopped walking but did not turn around. I asked if he believed he could have saved them. He said very quietly, 'I don't know.' I asked if he thought about them. He said, 'Every day.' Then he walked away." That was the only public statement Thomas Garrett ever made. By summer, the story had faded from the newspapers. The families held memorial services. Margaret Fales moved back to Ohio with her daughters. William Mundy's mother in Ireland received a letter from the tunnel company expressing condolences and a check for $50. Elizabeth Garrett remained in Evanston. She continued to write letters to Thomas. She died in 1912, 5 years after Henry's disappearance. Her obituary in the Evanston Index makes no mention of her younger son. Thomas did not attend her funeral. He moved frequently in the years following the incident. City directories and census records trace a path through Chicago's working-class neighborhoods: Pilsen, Bridgeport, back of the yards. He worked as a dockhand, a stockyard laborer, a night watchman. None of the jobs lasted more than a few months. In 1910, he was treated at Cook County Hospital for pneumonia. The attending physician's notes describe him as malnourished, withdrawn, uncooperative with care. When asked if he had family who could be notified, Thomas said no. In 1914, he enlisted in the army. His service record shows he was assigned to a labor battalion and deployed to France in 1918. He served without incident and was discharged in 1919 with an honorable record. A bunkmate, interviewed years later for an oral history project, remembered him as the kind of guy who never started a conversation but never avoided one either. Polite, kept to himself. I don't think I ever saw him smile. When asked if Thomas had ever spoken about his past, the bunkmate said, "Once, maybe. We were digging trenches and somebody joked about being buried alive. Garrett stopped digging. Didn't say anything, just stopped. After a while, he started again. That was it." Thomas returned to Chicago in 1920. He took a job as a janitor at a Lutheran church on the North Side. The pastor, Reverend Oscar Lindstrom, recalled him in a 1954 interview. Thomas was punctual, thorough, and entirely silent. He attended services occasionally but never took communion. I once asked him if he'd like to speak with me privately. I thought perhaps he was troubled. He thanked me and said no. In 1926, Thomas was struck by a streetcar on Clark Street. He suffered a broken leg and was hospitalized for 3 weeks. During his stay, a nurse named Ann Colby attempted to take a medical history. Her notes, preserved in the hospital's archives, include this exchange. Nurse: "Do you have any family we should contact?" Thomas: "No." Nurse: "No one at all?" Thomas: "No one left." He was discharged on November 18, 1926. He returned to his rented room above a tailor's shop on Milwaukee Avenue. On the morning of December 3, 1926, the tailor found him dead. The coroner's report lists the cause as heart failure. Thomas Garrett was 48 years old. There was no funeral, no obituary. The Lutheran church paid for a burial in a potter's field north of the city. Reverend Lindstrom presided over a brief graveside service. He was the only attendee. In his personal journal, Lindstrom wrote, "I prayed for Thomas today. I prayed that whatever he carried, he is free of it now. I do not know if he believed in forgiveness. I hope he found it anyway. The grave is unmarked." Nearly a century later, the question remains, what happened in Section 7? The physical evidence suggests a sudden and catastrophic flood. The timeline supports this. The absence of bodies is consistent with strong currents and the tunnel's connection to the river. All of this points to a tragic accident. 4 men caught in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. But Thomas Garrett survived. And Thomas Garrett refused to explain how. Over the years, theories have emerged. Some are plausible, others are speculative. None can be confirmed. One theory, proposed by a retired civil engineer in a 1963 article for Chicago History, suggests that Thomas may have been separated from the group before the flooding began, perhaps sent ahead to check a junction or delayed by a task. When the water came, he was already in a safer position. Guilt, the engineer speculated, kept him silent. He could not bear to admit he had been spared by chance. Another theory, advanced by a journalist in 1981, suggests that Thomas may have made a decision in the chaos of the flood, a choice about who to help or which direction to go. Perhaps he tried to save one man and had to leave the others. Perhaps he froze. Perhaps he ran. The silence in this interpretation is the silence of shame. A third theory, quieter and less often discussed, is darker. It notes the bandages on Thomas's hands, the chemical smell, the fact that he refused medical examination. It asks, what if the flood was not the only danger in that tunnel? What if something else happened? Something Thomas witnessed or participated in or survived by means he could not justify? This theory has no evidence, but it persists. The historian's task is not to solve the mystery, it is to present what can be known and to acknowledge what cannot. What can be known: Thomas Garrett entered the tunnels with 3 other men. Only he emerged. He was offered every opportunity to explain, by authorities, by journalists, by the families of the dead. He declined them all. He lived the rest of his life as a man in exile from his own story. What cannot be known? Whether he was a victim or a survivor. Whether his silence protected others or only himself. Whether he carried guilt or grief or something else entirely. But there is one thing the evidence does suggest. The silence was not accidental. It was not the result of trauma or confusion. Thomas Garrett was, by all accounts, clear-headed and deliberate in his refusal to speak. He knew what he was doing, and he never wavered. In his final years, Thomas worked alone, lived alone, and died alone. He left no letters, no diary, no confession. The only words he ever spoke on the subject were, "I don't remember." But memory is not the same as truth. People forget things they wish to forget. They also forget things they cannot afford to remember. And sometimes they choose silence because the alternative, whatever it might be, is worse. Margaret Fales, in a letter to the police in 1908, wrote, "I do not believe Thomas Garrett forgot what happened. I believe he decided we were better off not knowing. She may have been right. There are truths that destroy the people who hear them. There are stories that, once told, cannot be taken back. And there are silences that protect not the speaker, but the listener." Perhaps Thomas Garrett understood this. Perhaps he looked at the grieving widow, the heartbroken mother, the orphaned children, and made a calculation. Perhaps he weighed what he knew against what they could bear. And perhaps he chose to carry the weight himself. Or perhaps he simply could not face what he had done. We do not know. We will never know. The tunnel where the 4 men disappeared was sealed in 1909, part of a larger closure of unstable sections. The Chicago Tunnel Company ceased operations in 1959. The tunnels themselves remain, mostly flooded, accessible only to urban explorers and city maintenance crews. Section 7 is unmarked on modern maps. In 2003, a team of historians and engineers attempted to locate the site of the 1907 breach. They found the general area, but could not pinpoint the exact location. The brickwork had been reinforced and rebuilt multiple times. Any evidence had long since been buried. But in the archived records of the Chicago Police Department, in the letters held by the Chicago History Museum, and in the silence that follows every question about Thomas Garrett, the incident endures. Not as a solved mystery, but as a reminder. Some answers are taken to the grave, and some silences are chosen. Thomas Garrett chose his. And whatever happened in the tunnel beneath LaSalle and Washington on the night of March 3rd, 1907, whatever he saw, whatever he did, whatever he survived, died with him. The city moved on. The families mourned. The records were filed away. And the man who refused to explain how he lived was buried in an unmarked grave, his silence intact. It remains intact still.